Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be baking. I have to admit that the methods that I'm using today and some of the ingredients might not necessarily be super accessible to everyone, but I do plan on working on a version very soon that will be a little bit more accessible. This recipe is definitely not for the faint of heart. It's not super challenging, but it does take 3 days from start to finish, so you have to be patient. All right, well, let's make some bread. So the first step in our recipe is to wake up our sourdough. In order to do that, we will take a little bit of it and we will add it to equal parts of water and flour. The quantity of sourdough that we use in ratio to the flour and water will affect how quickly it grows. In the case of this recipe, we want a relatively slow moving starter. That way we can get the maximum amount of flavor. So we'll be doing a 1-2-2. So for every 1 part of the sourdough starter, we'll have 2 parts of water and 2 parts of flour. I'm using a flour mixture here. It is part whole wheat flour and part bread flour. That's just what I feed my starters. Since we only need about 50 grams of active sourdough in the recipe, I'll be using about 20 grams of sourdough starter, 40 grams of water, and 40 grams of the flour mixture, and that will give me plenty of starter to work with. Once everything's in the bowl, just give it a good stir. And then we'll just cover that with cling film and set it to the side. A note on using single-use plastics: we'll be trying to recycle and reuse this piece throughout the entire recipe. After you mix all these ingredients, you're just going to set this aside on the counter for a couple of hours. It's going to be different depending on your sourdough, how well it was fed before, when it was fed before, the exact ratios, the types of flours that you use, what the temperature is like in your home. There's so many factors that it's hard to just say wait 2 hours and then use it, or wait 4 hours and then use it. In the video, I actually mix mine in a bowl. If you're just starting out, it might be much more useful to put it into a jar, because when you use a jar, you'll actually be able to see how much it's growing over time. And you're looking for this to roughly double in size. Actually, the perfect amount of time is once it's risen to its peak and it's sat there for a short amount of time, it will slowly start to recede. And once it starts to recede, that's when it's matured and you have a window of time that you can use it. And at that point, it's still very much awake and ready to go, but it's starting to slow down just a little bit. That ends up being the ideal time in my recipe to take this and move on to the next step. The reason for that is because we actually want the overall process to go as slow as possible, because the longer the time takes, the more flavor that we end up building. Now you may wonder, why not just set this up super slow and let it take a very, very long time, but there is a limit to how long it can take before it breaks, falls apart, or gets moldy, so got to be careful. Now to make the pre-ferment, we'll take 50 grams of the Levain. We'll add 145 grams of warm water and then 200 grams of bread flour. The pre-ferment method that I'm using in my recipe here is akin to what you might find in a French baguette recipe, but instead of using regular yeast, I'm using sourdough starter. Now time to give it a mix. I like to get my hands in. The nature of a pre-ferment is to take roughly 50% of the dough ingredients and start that, let it run overnight to build some flavor, and then add in the other half of the ingredients the following day. Because you're only using a small amount of the ingredients, it would make using a stand mixer for this really challenging. A stand mixer is going to need a certain amount of ingredients in it before it really is able to do its job at all. And getting your hands in and getting a feel for the dough is really, I think, very important in understanding exactly when your dough is ready, whether it needs more water or it needs more flour. It's just part of the process. What I'm doing in this part of the video is pretty similar to a stretch and fold. It's not actually necessary. It's just an old habits die hard situation where this is how I mix dough for almost every bread. We want all of the ingredients to be incorporated here, and I'm going to definitely mix them up pretty good to verify that all of the flour is hydrated, but we don't need to go crazy. We're not actually looking to build any structure at this point. Now, if you own a dough scraper, it will help out with getting all of the ingredients off the side of the bowl. Personally, though, just having a little bit of the dough on my fingers makes quick work of it. At this point in the recipe, you have some options. What you can do is take this and put it directly into the fridge and let it hang out overnight, or you can let it sit on the counter for about 2 hours to develop a little bit more flavor, get rolling a little bit quicker, and then put it in the fridge overnight. Personally, I would definitely recommend trying to leave it on the counter for about 2 hours, but depending on your time and your schedule, it might just not be an option. It's going to taste great either way. And don't forget to reuse that previous piece of cling film. So the pre-ferment has spent the night in the fridge, and now we're ready to mix the rest of the dough. Start with 250 grams of bread flour, 100 grams of warm water, we're going to put in 4 grams of yeast. I'm using instant yeast, so I don't need to bloom it, but if you have active dry, you're going to want to put that in the warm water and let it hang out for a few minutes. 6 grams of just regular caster sugar, white sugar. This is 9 grams of kosher salt. And then we'll finish it off with 20 grams of olive oil. Mixing this dough with the existing pre-ferment can be a little bit tricky. So some of the things that you may want to try are to let the pre-ferment sit out on the counter for maybe an hour or so to kind of come to room temperature. You can also break up the pre-ferment into smaller pieces and spread it around the bowl to make it a little bit easier to mix in. Now, when we're mixing up this portion of the dough, what we'll see is that it's much drier and it takes a little bit more effort to get it to come together. This is still definitely part of the mixing stage, and I would not consider this part of kneading. Once you feel that you have the ingredients more or less incorporated, you can go ahead and transfer them out to your work surface. Having a little pile or a bowl of flour to the side here is very useful, so that if you do need flour for any reason, you can go and grab some and you don't have to worry about getting the whole bucket of flour dirty. So it's tricky to define a specific amount of time to knead the dough. If you press really hard and you push really far, or you do it really fast, you might not need to knead it quite as long as somebody else. It's okay to say that it might take 7 to 10 minutes. That's probably pretty accurate, but you just never know. If you're doing this by hand, which I recommend, you don't need to worry about over kneading the dough. It's just not going to happen. Here you can see I'm doing a method where I go with one hand and then I push across the other direction with the other hand and kind of scoop it back. I like doing it this way because I feel like I get 2 kneads for every 1 pass. And right about here, I switch methods to pushing it out on one side, giving it a little bit of a turn, and then doing it the same way. This helps me to create a lot of tension on one side of the dough, which is something I definitely want to do. You'll know that the kneading process is done when you can press 2 fingers into the dough and it will bounce back, but it will just take a moment, like this. At this point in the process, you don't need to let it sit on the counter for a couple of hours before you put it in the fridge. You can just go ahead and throw it right in. But don't forget to use that same piece of cling film. A good rule of thumb with nonstick spray is however much you think you should do, and then a little bit more. I almost never add flour to the pan like this. At this point, I've spent some time trying to get a slow motion shot of me throwing flour onto the counter, and I've just put way too much out. Don't use this much flour. I've let the dough sit out on the counter for maybe an hour just to kind of come to room temperature. Take it out of the bowl. We're going to spread it out into roughly a rectangle, and then I'm going to fold it over into about 1/3, and then use my I don't know, the thumb bit of your palm to press it down. And I'll turn it around so you can see it here. And you'll see I actually have a really difficult time getting it to stick right there. And that's because I have too much flour on the board. So I'll do like some little pinchies and try to make it work. And it works out fine, but definitely too much flour. And then for this last one, you can do the same palm method, or you can sort of turn it and pull it onto itself like this. Just make sure you get a good seam. And now you'll just splorp it into the pan. I spread it around a little bit, cover it with a tea towel, a damp tea towel, and let it sit until it's done rising. And voila! Okay, it's not quite done rising yet, but that's perfect. This is the right time for me to start preheating the oven. Now, I have a convection oven, so I'll be setting mine to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you don't have convection, you'll probably want to set it a little bit hotter, like 350. Oven's preheated. The loaf has finished rising. You can see it's come to just about the top of the pan. Slide it in. Got a sous chef here that can tell the loaf is just about ready. Got a cooling rack ready to go. Once the baking is complete, you want to get this loaf out of the pan immediately to cool. Okay, and that is my half sour sandwich loaf recipe. I hope you guys try it. I hope you enjoy it. Maybe you learn something. Maybe you find a relatively inexpensive, and again, it's not a ton of work. It's not a lot of challenging steps. It just takes time and maybe a little bit of scheduling to get it going. But it's really, really an absolutely delicious loaf of bread that is very versatile. I don't think that the sourdough takes it in such a direction that you couldn't use this bread for peanut butter and jelly, but it also just makes absolutely incredible toast for breakfast in the morning. And as always, thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. I think I already said that, but whatever. I really do believe that this bread is totally worth the steps and the time. I've been making it for the past month or so for our household, and we just absolutely love it. So you should definitely try it and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I hope that you'll like the video, subscribe to the video, leave a comment, or tag me in your social media if you try the recipe, and I would love to see what you guys are making. See you next time.